Spokane listens when business talks. Welcome to Business Talks, the region's only local business talk show with your host, Ryan McNeice. Business Talks is brought to you by our friends at STCU and Well Dressed Walrus. Now, let's get down to business with Business Talks.
Welcome to Business Talks. I'm Ryan McNeice, and we're here in the studio with Cory, Violette, and Richard Fox, Gonzaga basketball alums. Thanks for being here, you guys.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Today we're going to be talking about the interesting topic of the business of college athletics, and both of you clearly have experienced a long history of playing at all levels, professionally, collegiate, obviously high school, and et cetera. I'd imagine you both have in-depth opinions on this issue, but it's a very widespread, deep issue. We only have a half an hour here today, but in this concept of paying college athletes, it goes without saying, everyone's aware that reading the newspaper and otherwise, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and yet the players don't get paid. Obviously, there's some compensation for scholarships, et cetera. But what are some of your initial thoughts on this concept?
Well, first off, it's a difficult subject in that if you just simplify things and say, should an athlete be paid at the amateur level? Does that mean salary? Does it mean endorsements? What does that mean? I mean, certainly we're talking about some kind of monetary payment, but I think that's where you start to see the arguments really arise. Well, what is an athlete entitled to? What are they already being paid in terms of scholarship money or advantage at an institution? What does that really look like? And I think this year with the collegiate basketball scandals and the magnifying glass that's being put on all these programs, it brings the issue to the forefront. What kind of a financial benefit is acceptable at an institution, and how does it get to the player? I think it's interesting. There's some basics
versus paid versus endorsements. I mean, there's a lot of
right.
Angles there, but what are some of those points?
I think one thing that I find to be, aside from getting into which institutions can pay more for players and concentrating talent at institutions with more funds, I think aside from that, I find it a little hard to understand how an individual, athlete or otherwise, is not allowed to take advantage of his or her own celebrity. So, clearly, if you look at a Gonzaga where you have let's say, go back a little ways, and you have an Adam Morrison that's generating a tremendous amount of interest. Maybe the school, I can understand, isn't allowed to pay him, but how is he in his lifetime as a college basketball player not allowed to take advantage of that notoriety, whether it's good or bad?
What he's bringing to both the program as well as the university as a whole.
Right. I think it's going to become more difficult for the NCAA to say that they actually should be able to control that person's ability to be a voice in some way. And if Nike wants to put some clothing on them or shoes and then pay them to exclusively wear those or say things about them, I think that's becoming more difficult to say that that person doesn't have a right to do that.
What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think there's a distinction between mistreatment and exploitation. I don't think college athletes as a whole are mistreated. I think it's a fabulous situation. You get to go to college. If you choose to stay 4 years or 5 years, you're going to get a college degree at no cost. I mean, we all know people that have incredible loads of student loan debt. It's a great deal. These students get to go, these athletes get to get their college paid for, and they get to play in these big arenas, and they're on TV, and that's what they focus on. And I don't think anyone's saying that that's not a really cool experience and a fabulous opportunity. It's just when you look at the amount of money, and let's be clear, we're talking about revenue-producing sports, men's basketball and college football. When you look at those two,
broadcast dollars, et cetera. I mean, big broadcast dollars.
The amount of money is in the billions, and to Cory's point earlier about whether or not Nike or some shoe company should be able to provide, say, an athlete of Adam Morrison's stature at the time, some sort of additional revenue or income because of his celebrity. there's clearly value in him wearing Nike, or Nike wouldn't pay college coaches 7 figures
absolutely
in order to have the rights to have those athletes wear.
And let's be honest, it's not the coach wearing the Nike shoes. It's in your example, Adam Morrison, et cetera. You're right, and whether that's trickling down. But you make a good point. Exploitation versus fair compensation. There is a fine line there.
Yeah, and I what I hear a lot is people are trying to figure out a system. Mm-hmm. So how do you pay athletes? When I think sometimes the best solution is the most simple solution, which is don't restrict it. There's already a massive disparity between the Kentuckys and Dukes of the world. Let's focus on basketball because that's what we're most familiar with. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, Gonzaga. Mm-hmm. Gonzaga is not in the living rooms of the top 10 kids in the country every year, but Duke and Kentucky are. So if Duke and Kentucky want to go pay the number 1 recruit in the country $1 million to come play for them, Gonzaga's still going to be trying to recruit the athletes that they're recruiting. They're not in that space. And that disparity only grows as you move all the way down to 300-plus Division I member institutions in college basketball. That's a separate conversation. Mm-hmm. Why there are that many, I do not know.
I happen to agree with you there, though. I don't think that the disparity of talent, you can only put 12 guys on a team. So, however much you're going to pay them, those kids that are worth the most are still finding their market. Just exactly like Richard's saying. Mm-hmm. They're still going to the Dukes. They're still going to the Kentuckys. That's not going to change. There's only a certain number of spots on each team. 5 guys can be on the floor. So, it's not to be overly, free markets, but they tend to find a solution, whether it happens to be based on a dollar amount or otherwise.
You potentially cap. Much like they do in whether it be pro football, pro basketball, that cap so Kentucky can't pay more than.
I don't think it's. I think if you get the more the money's out in the open, the better the system's probably going to be. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe Notre Dame says we're not going to pay athletes. We're Notre Dame, and you're getting world-class education, and we've got our own TV deal, and they're already competing at a disadvantage because their academic standards are higher than anybody else recruiting.
And if you still want to play for us and be a part of this,
if Ohio State wants to go pay the number 1 linebacker in the country $750,000 and Alabama says I'm only going to pay you $500,000, then I mean I don't think it's going to come at the expense of some of these mid-major or even lower high major schools. I mean the talent's still going to flow kind of the way it flows already.
Well, am I correct in how I'm hearing you both describe it? Is to a certain extent this is already occurring in the sense that whether you're talking about Alabama football or Kentucky or Duke basketball, that no, they're not paying athletes directly, but there is some sort of intrinsic compensation and or benefits as to why those 12 players are playing for Kentucky or playing for Duke. I think you're both mentioning that to a certain extent, that it might not be all that much different now.
No, they're finding the kids in general are choosing the schools that they want to go to based on a couple of things. One is, are they gonna win there? Are they gonna play there?
Chance at the next level.
A chance at the next level. I mean, those things are already in their minds. I don't think the funding aspect would necessarily change that. How you do it, I think, could get interesting. I mean, there's certainly a lot of things you could say if we start to pay the athletes, and the market price of those athletes gets to a point where it detracts from the way these athletic programs are funding other parts of the school. Certainly you're going to have people raise their hand and say, well, how's it going to affect that? Right. I just think that anytime you have a situation like that, what you're asking somebody to do is make a sacrifice. And again, it's hard to, I don't think people like to hear that a college athlete's exploited given what they seem to get, except that anytime you have somebody's market value or economic value understated or the word artificial was perfect, artificially prohibited at a certain level, I think you've got an unfairness thing. And I think that's becoming more and more prevalent, and these schools are trying to find ways to work around it, and it's against a lot of times the NCAA rules.
And we're talking a very small kind of niche subset of college athletes in these.
It's true.
I mean, the reality is the situation for myself, I'm sure it's for Cory, was perfect in Gonzaga. I never had any inkling or thought that I deserve more. This was a fabulous opportunity. But for a guy like Dan Dickow we played with, who was all the rage nationally, Adam, I'm using local examples, but you can find these examples all over the country.
Right.
I don't think those athletes should be, to your point, prohibited from being able to monetize that in a way. I mean, and this isn't not necessarily the university or the institution has to pay this money.
Right.
This is third-party income, revenue from a third party, if it's through endorsements or shooting a crappy local commercial or whatever it might be. The kid's got to file a W-2.
Mm-hmm.
That's
as an
it.
employee.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or whatever it might be. I mean, I don't know of another industry or job title where there's some overarching compensation structure that everyone adheres to. They sure don't adhere to any sort of universal compensation structure in athletic departments and with coaches. Right. And those systems seem to work fine. Talent flows across conferences, within conferences. People earn a living. They grow their careers. I don't know why there's this feeling that some sort of system has to be
a unified system, if you will.
And the only reason I can think that people feel that way is because there is a sense of this doesn't feel right.
Right, fair competition.
This feels
amateur.
kind of just dirty in a way, because it is such a drastic departure from what we have now.
Well, but I think as you both are making good points, so to a certain extent, it is what it is already in terms of the highest stakes of competition. Those multi-billion-dollar TV contracts, broadcast contracts, shoe contracts, that is occurring today. So to act like that isn't occurring.
I think the best example Gonzaga has ever had is Rui Hachimura. Imagine the amount of wealth he probably could start generating today if he could sign endorsement deals back home in Japan.
Yeah.
He is a rock star. Nobody here can appreciate. Adam Morrison pales in comparison to what Rui Hachimura is in his home country.
As a brand.
Yes.
Right. As a brand. Well, and I think it was the New York Times this weekend said 2011, 27% of the overall population thought we should pay college athletes. In 2015, it shot up to 38%. So 38% of a sampling believes that we should be paying college athletes.
Yeah, I think you're starting to. It's tough to put yourself in the shoes of a college athlete and think of it as, well, maybe they aren't. Maybe that's not right, because it looks like in a lot of cases they're living pretty well. I mean, Gonzaga's flying to games on charter jets.
Right.
It looks like, hey, isn't that enough? Well, I think enough is such a relative term. You really have to make a scale for it. And I think in every other aspect of American life, we tend to let an economy or a market find the value.
Well, Cory, I think your point's well taken. Enough compared to the perspective of what type of revenue is being generated.
Right.
And so it
not
has
to mention,
to be balanced in terms of what that actual revenue looks like.
Right. And then I think I would second the Hachimura example. And then I would say, what if you think about it like this? Because we were talking about sports. So right now, I used to play basketball in Japan, and I'm in touch with a lot of those folks, and he is absolutely off the charts there. He's, I believe, one of the first naturally born Japanese citizens to play at this level with this kind of notoriety. But let's say, so he goes, and right now, if you opened it up and said, hey, he can have some sponsorships and he can be compensated via endorsements. Right now he can't. So let's say at the end of his senior year, God forbid he gets hurt.
Right.
Well, he's missed 4 massive years of revenue that might set him up for maybe the rest of his life,
including the rest of his family.
And that injury will now preclude him from ever having that.
And then, but the counter to that, which I think is a false argument, is, well, now he has a college degree and he can go get a job. And that is true.
Yeah.
He can go get a job making, say, depending on his profession, $50,000 to $80,000 out of college
versus several
versus
million
perhaps
a year.
having made a few $1 million while still being a student. Earning money via endorsements or, again, some third-party avenue does not preclude you from having to be a student too. you can still maintain all the student requirements at these universities. So I suspect in a situation like this, Rui Hachimura would be happy to tell you where to put the degree.
Right.
And he'd be pretty upset.
Let's take a short little break and come right back talking about the business of college athletics.
Hi, this is Kurt Stockwell with Well Dressed Walrus. We are a local website design and development company here in Spokane. What we do is build beautiful, usable websites for local businesses. A website needs to be beautiful. It needs to be usable for your users, your customers, and yourself. Contact us anytime. We'd love to talk with you about your online marketing.
The following is sponsored by our friends and community supporters at McNeice Wheeler Attorneys. McNeice Wheeler is a boutique law firm in Spokane, handling matters in both Washington and Idaho. Areas of law include business law, wills, trusts and estates, family law, personal injury and wrongful death, and real estate matters. For your full-service legal needs, contact McNeice Wheeler Attorneys. The economy is getting stronger. Banks are lending again, and interest rates are at historic lows. Now is a great time to buy your dream home. The caring and knowledgeable professionals at Homes for You have been helping people just like you for over 20 years. They take the time to listen to what you want and will help you find just the right home in Washington or Idaho. Real estate is what we do at Homes for You, 928-5782, or visit online at homes4uspokane.com.
Welcome back to Business Talks, and I'm here in the studio with Cory Violette and Richard Fox having a discussion about the business of college athletics. And thank you both. I wish we had an hour and a half to talk about this. There's so many elements and facets of this. Just off air there, we were chatting about where did this schematic for this current way of looking at the NCAA in terms of the rules, regulations, and paying athletes, where did that structure come from?
You probably have to ask a historian about that, but what I would say is that when college athletics came on the scene, or even leisure sports in general, let's say, you're going back a long ways. But originally, and it's tough to see this coming, but the disparity between what a college athlete was making and what a pro athlete was making wasn't quite as large. I mean, a fledgling pro football team back in the 30s and 40s, same thing with basketball. They were making money, but
but proportionally not.
But it was almost like they were just covering their expenses, their operating costs, and
maybe more like a minor league baseball team experience.
I think Alabama made $144 million last year net.
Yeah.
So that changes the value of a system or the function, the ability of that system to actually operate the way it was intended to. Sometimes things just become obsolete, and I think the NCAA, in a lot of ways, the rules and the way it's structured have become obsolete when you look at the money involved. I think you made the point off when we were in the break, Cory. No one considered the amount of money that we'd be seeing now, even 10 years ago.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, you look
Billions,
at that,
not millions.
right? There was the meme for the NBA last year about the Oprah Winfrey, you get a max contract, you get a max contract, and that's those things are tough to foresee, right. And I would say obsolete is the word for it. You have an institution that the only avenue for them really is to play college basketball, or
right.
to
It's
play.
their gift. It is their gift.
It's their way of maybe receiving an education, if that's what they're going for. Or I mean, I think we were all delusional at one point. We thought, well, this is the NBA stepping stone, and obviously the numbers don't lead you to believe that you're going to make that, but that's what the thought is, and as misguided as that can sometimes be, the only avenue for that generally is NCAA. Now, I think one thing that's kind of interesting is the NBA, as business-minded as it is maybe finding a way to encroach on that a little bit with the D-League. It's a very small market right now, but you are starting to see kids get attracted to, you know what, this is a better deal for me and for my family. So.
Well, we were mentioned statistically that 38%, 2015, that were polled thought that we should be paying college athletes. What do you think the core of, or reasoning in psychology, that 62% are basically saying that we should not?
Because I think language matters. And I think if people had an idea, some certainty about what pay meant, I think that number would skyrocket.
And if they were in that predicament?
Right.
Well, but we're losing that ability more and more nowadays, right, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. But it's if people understood what pay meant, it's not $20 million, it's $20,000 to this, or whatever number might be on average, or how small a group would actually be impacted. And it's, they can just go out and get endorsements of their own. It doesn't cost the school anything above and beyond what they're already doing. I think people would probably be much more supportive of that, because it's one kind of value we all share is right. People should earn what they deserve,
and yet you're both hitting on the word, if I can use the sanctity of college sports and amateur sports across the board. When we used to talk about the Olympics and whether pro basketball players should play in the Olympics, et cetera, and that's of course 20 years in our past now. But this concept of the sanctity of the amateur, what do you think about that?
I think that really runs deep. I think there is a pretty significant percentage of people that, particularly in college athletics, maybe people that don't follow athletics. I mean, if you were an avid college football or college basketball fan, I can't imagine you have any illusions that you're watching amateur sports.
Right.
I mean, and if you do, then you've probably, there's other things we should ask you, because there's no way that you can look at the product and look at the production and look at the money and say, this is amateur athletics.
Yeah, there's a couple arcane views. I think that's one of them, is that I don't want to say there's no sanctity anymore, but it's a business. It's very difficult to deny that, and so you've got certain employees of that business that are not being compensated commensurate with their value. The other thing that I think is a little bit arcane is to say that I hope this doesn't sound elitist, but let's say I got a scholarship to Gonzaga, but growing up, my parents said, you need to get these grades. School is very, very important. My dad, I'm always saying, you're one injury away from using your brain the rest of your life. Versus, let's say a kid that didn't come from a background like that, where school wasn't important, where maybe they were in an environment where school was just kind of something you had to go to, and it wasn't a place where you learned. So you give me a scholarship and you give that player a scholarship. Did we get the same value at Gonzaga? I mean, I would argue there's no way. I mean, I'm starting at a completely different point than that other kid is. And to say that what I can glean from a Gonzaga education, I'm just starting at way in front of that
different
person.
Jumping off point.
And that's not my fault or his fault, and there's some luck involved there. But there's no way you can clearly make the argument that, hey, you've both received the exact same thing. I think that's not a fair way of looking at that. And to combat that, if you said, hey, there's no way we're going to pay college athletes and we're skipping all the endorsements, well, at the very least, to make those two values the same, why is it that at the end of the 4 years you've lost the ability to also go to school? Let's say that this person that started well behind me, for instance, in terms of education, has the opportunity to come to the realization that at 30 years old they'd like to go back, because you know what, they didn't realize that they could have gotten this education, or that it would have helped them, or they weren't ready for it. To what detriment is it to the institution to let that kid come back to school and get his degree? So the institutions are saying, you have a 4-year scholarship, we don't really care if you get your degree. I mean, yes, we want you to get your degree, but we're not willing to necessarily put ourselves out there. If we give you till 30 or 35, I guess you can't give it an indefinite amount of time. But let's get you that education that we said this was really about.
Right. That we promised you in the beginning.
Yeah, and let's be clear that scholarships are year to year. If you're a student athlete and you're aware of the rule, you can request a 4-year guarantee. Mm-hmm. The school is not obligated to give that to you. It wasn't until 2 or 3 years ago that the value of a scholarship on average actually covered room and board and food and books and all that.
Right. Tuition.
This is not a system where it's, hey, 4 years, you can come to school here, we're going to take care of everything. We don't care how bad how you play. No. You have to perform as a student.
Merit-based.
Yeah, these are merit-based scholarships. Mm-hmm. And you look at the transfers in basketball, for example, it's approaching 1,000 a year between Division I. It's not that there's 1,000 kids who are dissatisfied and think that they're getting a bad deal. There's a lot of those kids that are getting pushed out because it's a merit-based. So
it is, absolutely is.
It's just such a big idea, and also it's also not something that's necessarily. We clearly have thoughts on it, and we've lived it, but for most people, this is not top of mind, top of the list, an issue that has to be resolved, and that's keeping them up at night or really getting them going versus some of the other issues that we're hearing about. However,
as we've mentioned throughout today's discussion, if an individual had the ability to be in somebody else's shoes and put the time commitment that both of you experienced in your college playing days, as well as many other athletes, as a wage earner, if you were able to commensurate that concept of the hours that you put in as a wage earner for the university, I think that person, if they were...
The overwhelming majority of student athletes, it is awesome. Mm-hmm. It is the way it is currently constructed,
an
works for them.
An unbelievable opportunity.
I started from a similar jumping off point as Cory. Getting an education was a huge part of the value I got out of Gonzaga, and I recognized that at the time. But for a smaller percentage of these high-level athletes that can generate this additional income because of how good they are, their marketability, whatever it might be, they shouldn't be. It's just distasteful in my mind to artificially restrict their ability to go out and make money via an entity outside of the academic institution. Given
the professional sports level, but even at the college Division I heightened level we're discussing today, the legality of the intellectual property, the branding of the image, so whether you're talking about Adam Morrison, as we were using the example earlier, or yourselves, if they were to come out with the next Power Station game, Microsoft, etc., video game, and they're utilizing Cory, Violette, and Richard Fox as a brand, as an identity, that's a whole nother legal question of what's the value to that gaming industry.
Well, and I think we've seen that college, I think the O'Bannon case basically killed that industry. But I remember signing my scholarship, and not that at that age you read through the whole thing, but it caught my eye that you relinquish your rights with respect to your image, your likeness, all of that sort of thing. Now, it was awesome for me because I got to see myself in a video game.
Yeah.
That was
all I wanted. Were you as tall as you actually are?
It's actually funny. So I remember my first year it was like 6'11" white guy with dreadlocks and a tattoo. It was like they had no idea what I looked like. But it was awesome, But for a lot of athletes, it's... I'm buying the game, and I want to be Adam Morrison in the game.
And you don't know to ask, right? You don't know to say, like, hey, well, that's really cool, but is that worth something? I think...
Is it commensurate with the income?
Is it commensurate?
We've been saying that throughout this discussion. And there's so many unique aspects of this, but one of them is that you have this labor force turnover every 4 years.
Right.
So you don't have quite enough time to develop a players union. And what if you had a 7-year college eligibility?
Well, Northwestern tried to do that, and that's what the NCAA just wrote it out.
National.
Let's just wait until they're out, and so you have this kind of blip on the radar time-wise, and so that's difficult too. If you said scholarships and eligibility last until you've decided to continue with or not your master's degree. Now you've got kids going to school for 6 years. Or 7 years. Now you're starting to look and say, you know what? I've been here 3-4 years, and this isn't quite right.
Well, and at the highest levels, as you mentioned, at Gonzaga, at Kentucky, at Duke, the one and done concept. 1 year of playing at the collegiate level, unpaid, if you will, and then potentially that next year the individual's making upteen millions of dollars.
Well, Zach Collins is a great example for GU. And I think the NBA is close to eliminating that rule. That's an NBA mandated rule. I think the NCAA gets too much criticism for that system when it's not imposed by them.
Right.
But a point I would make is I think there are probably people that are listening to this or people that we've spoken to that they think the arrangement's already equitable. And then when you talk to them, as we've kind of were discussing about, it's not equitable. The question always comes up, well, at what point is it finally fair? And I don't know. But I do know that when you have billions of dollars associated with men's basketball and college football, we are a long ways from that. We're not close to overcorrecting the situation.
Right.
So I'm not worried about...
Not close to equilibrium.
Yes, exactly. I'm not worried that if you were to make it more of a free market kind of system or arrangement, that all of a sudden you're going to have Kentucky's payroll is $27 million.
Right.
And quite frankly, if Alabama wants to pay their football team $100 million to play next season, they can just dip into their net income of $144 million.
Well, fascinating. Richard, Cory, thank you for being here. I honestly think we could discuss this for another couple hours because the levels, we're just at the surface, if you will. And,
sure.
I think we could really, and should in a later conversation, go down those different trails as to what the effects would be. If it isn't unified, if you will, across Division I, what are the effects going to be to the competition? I think you both made great points that it's not equal now. Would it change? Don't know. We'll have to talk about that later. Thank you both for being here. Thanks for joining us.
Business Talks is produced in Spokane, Washington by SpokaneTalksOnline.com, which is solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, and hear this program again online anytime at SpokaneTalksOnline.com. Business Talks is brought to you by our friends at STCU and Well Dressed Walrus,